This is Underdog Portfolio Weekly, hosted by Scott Connor.
Welcome back to another episode of Underdog Portfolio Weekly. Happy early holiday week to everybody that is tuning in. And I want to just give a shout out to everybody that has supported this venture thus far, has watched the live draft streams. It has been a blast to get different people on to walk through their draft process, to talk about their experience drafting this season, some of their strategies, some of their inputs. And it's been fun because we've been able to build some different teams, some teams that I probably would not have drafted myself, which is absolutely crucial when you are drafting in a large tournament like Best Ball Mania 5. So I'm here to just drop a quick update. It's been a while since I've done a short form video versus a live draft. So I'm going to get right into it and just talk through my experience thus far, go through some different things that I've noticed about my drafts and where the portfolio sits through about 2 months or so of drafting. And I'm going to use Spike Week. If you've never heard of it, spikeweek.com. They're not a sponsor or anything, but it is a great tool that has allowed me to manage the portfolio and really keeps you on track, especially when you're doing slow drafts. As anybody that watched the streams has seen, it's a little more difficult to incorporate in fast drafts, especially if you're trying to stream. But in slow drafts, it's absolutely crucial when you have a bunch going on at one time. It's a tool you can constantly sync your teams with, and it'll tell you exactly where you probably want to go in terms of stacking, in terms of correlation, and then also in terms of some other things if you want to look at different exposures while you're drafting. So I'm going to use Spike Weeks. Let me go ahead and switch over to that, and we'll talk through the Best Ball Mania specifically. I could probably go through and look at all of the other tournaments. There's been a couple Superflex tournaments. There's been a couple short form tournaments where they're only lasting a weekend or so, and you have limited number of entries. So maybe I'll do a different video highlighting some of those smaller contests that I've jumped into. But here is Spike Week. So we're going to start with this, and actually I'm going to tab over to my Underdog page just so everybody can see the exposures. And this is for Best Ball Mania 5. So right now, as of this video, we're about 2 months in drafting, and I have drafted 43 Best Ball Mania 5 drafts thus far. So I still have a ways to go. Many smart individuals out there have mentioned this tournament is probably not going to last until Labor Day or the start of the season or the first week of the season. So I'm going to have to get to drafting probably when I come back from a short vacation after the 4th of July. I'm probably going to jump into a ton of slow drafts. So if you're going to be interested in doing slow drafts in July, you're going to probably run into me. Probably 30 or 40 I'm going to try to knock out before we get to August. I don't want to be so far behind where I'm having to just draft and draft and draft. But we're 43 drafts in. And as you can see, this is just the basic Underdog exposures for myself. And as you can see, kind of the diversity. This is one of the first things that I wanted to look at was how much am I spreading myself across the positions. So as you can see, 43 teams. I've only drafted 32 different quarterbacks. So if you look at just a real high level, you can see the highest exposure quarterbacks. I'm still up there, 30% of Justin Fields. Then it really jumps down. 16% Will Levis, 14% Deshaun Watson, 11% Kyler, 11% Geno Smith. And then really nobody over 10% after that. I have some other high-end ones that I'm pretty high on. Mahomes, Burrow, Allen, you see Dak, Jared Goff, Justin Herbert. Those are on my higher end in terms of exposure. Then you go all the way down here, and you can see a couple of these that I've only drafted one time. One Lamar Jackson. That's got to change. 1, 2 CJ Strouds. That's probably got to change. So as you can tell, I'm probably not one of the people that has a lot of exposure to the Texans and the Ravens game from the quarterback perspective. That's something I probably have noticed that I need to fix. We'll look at the receivers here in just a second. We'll look at the tight ends here in just a second. But from a quarterback perspective, that is going to be one of the higher rostered stacks or higher rostered correlation games going into week 17. Now, those teams have to make it there. But I think the key is I want more exposure to that game, meaning I want more teams that have a Ravens weapon with Stroud. I want more teams that have a Texans receiver with Lamar. But I also have to figure those are going to be very popular. So I have a choice to make. Do I want to just stay low on the game that I know everybody else is chasing? Or do I want to draft a bunch more teams with Lamar, with Stroud, with the Texans or Ravens weapons, but try to differentiate them? I think that's a huge thing that people haven't talked about enough is when you're leaning into some of these stacks that are going to be extremely highly correlated and highly rostered. If those teams perform how you think they should, a lot of people are going to have players from those games in the week 15, 16, 17. You get to week 16, there's going to be a lot of teams that already have Texans and Ravens that have survived, meaning depending on the different players that you have around those stacks is what's going to separate you when you get to the finals if you're lucky enough to have a team that gets to the finals. Now, if you're going for a obscure stack on a different game, you can probably play it a little bit differently just because out of your 150, I'm probably not going to build 10 Patriots Chargers stacks as my primary. So I'm probably not having to spread the wealth among those 10 because I may not have 10. Whereas here, there's so many Texans, there's so many Ravens, there's 2 top 6 quarterbacks on both teams. There's going to be a lot of potential to build different teams. But how do you separate the typical Lamar, Mark Andrews, Nico Collins team? How do you differentiate that team from all of the others? And it's probably a little more complex than just drafting Dalton Schultz or just drafting Rashad Bateman or just drafting even Isaiah Likely or Tez Walker. Like you probably have to maybe go a little bit deeper. Hey, you know what? I built 3 teams that look like that, but I went with John Mechie. I went with one that has Noah Brown. I went with a couple that have Nelson Aguilar. I went with a couple that have Keaton Mitchell. Like you just never know. You want to probably have more pieces of that game, but you want to do it differently. And then you also want to say, okay, if I'm going to build out 10 teams that have Texans and Ravens as primary pieces, I probably want to pick different other games that I'm adding with those. And that's just something that's very hard, even with 150 teams, to track that. And that's where Spike Week comes in. So I'll go into that here in just a second. But as you can see, I have 32 different quarterbacks. I have not leaned into the custodian QB super heavy. I've drafted obviously a couple, Michael Penix, Jacoby Brissett, and I don't think I've leaned into very many others specifically in BBM5. That's another goal that I have going forward, is to really make mention of trying that strategy, especially on teams where only 2 teams with Jalen Hurts, only 2 teams with CJ Stroud, like I mentioned, only 1 team with Lamar Jackson. Those are the teams to do it on. Those are the teams to stop taking Will Levis, Deshaun Watson, Geno Smith, Justin Fields as my QB2. I've done that a lot. And that's okay. I have exposure to those players, and I'm fine with that. But as you see, when I flip over to Spike Week here in just a second, I'm not building a lot of teams with certain structure, meaning the Patrick Mahomes or Lamar Jackson or CJ Stroud, and then going with the 2 obscure quarterbacks that give me some potential differentiation when you get to week 17, if the primary quarterback can get me there. So I'm going to flip over Spike Week just to highlight exactly what I'm talking about. So if you go down to here, this is team structure. So this is cool. It'll track your basic team structure or team build. So at the top, 20 of my teams are dual running back teams, meaning I've drafted 2 top 24 running backs. You know, if you look at some of the exposure at running back, 2 top 24 isn't really that hard to hit. And when you look at mine, Jaylen Warren's not top 24 anymore, but if he moves up 1 spot, that would bump up my percentage of dual running back teams. But then you scroll down, 16% Jonathan Taylor, 14% Bijan Robinson, 14% Najee Harris, 12% Joe Mixon. All of those are just going to fit that dual RB build. And if I have that much exposure to 4 of those guys in the top 24, it's just a matter of finding another one. 2 is not that hard to get. Let me flash back over here to Spike Week. As you can see, primarily what I've been doing, and this is interesting to me, not to skip ahead, but every time I go through these, I find like 4 or 5 different things that I want to talk about. Late round tight end, meaning I'm just going with 3 stinkers at tight end. Those are probably the teams I'm building with 3. As you can see, the construction roster build of the 43 teams, 7 of them are 2-5-8-3. 5 of them are 3-5-7-3. And those were very early. I'm not drafting any 3-5-7-3 teams anymore. It's either 3 tight ends or 3 quarterbacks. But as you can see, I'm more likely to go with 3 quarterbacks than I am 3 tight ends. But I do have 7 teams that are 2-5-8-3, 5 teams that are 3-5-7-3, and then 3 more teams here, 2-4-9-3 or 3-4-8-3. So I've gone with 3 tight end builds. If you add those up, 3, 5, you're looking at 15 of my 43 teams have been 3 tight end builds. And that makes sense. That's probably most of them are the late round tight end strategy. If I have 3 tight ends, I probably do not have a tight end inside of the top 6, top 12. Late round tight end is defined by no tight end outside of the top 12. So if I have 3, I'm probably not taking any inside the top 12. Now it's interesting because if you look at the elite tight end, that is my 3rd highest structured roster. That is 40%. So I think this is very key to highlight, and I'll highlight it right here. 82% of my teams, I'm doing one of 2 things. It is early tight end, meaning I have 1 in the top 6, and then I'm only going with 2. And a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm actually taking another one inside that top 17. There's usually a tier rake right around like Luke Musgrave, but I'm trying to get Freiermuth. I'm trying to get Dallas Goedert. I'm trying to get Brock Bowers. I'm trying to get Luke Musgrave is usually the cutoff for me. But I'm taking 2, and then I know for sure that I'm done. There is no temptation to take another. I'm already thinking in round 7, round 8, round 9. If there's somebody as my tight end 2, Brock Bowers falls a little past ADP, I'm taking him. David Njoku falls past ADP, I'm taking him. Only because I can stack or correlate both of those players later with the tight end. I can get Watson. I can get Derek Carr if I want to bring back on Brock Bowers. So I'm willing to take 2 tight ends, especially if they're at ADP value, because it automatically just eliminates that position from the rest of the board. When I do that, there is no thought of, I'm going to take Noah Fant in this draft. I'm going to take Chig Okonkwo. I'm going to take Mike Gesicki. And those players, if you go over to my tight end exposure, you'll see I'm fairly high exposure on those guys. Fant, 19%. Now, you see some others. Juwan Johnson, I've kind of stopped taking him due to the injury, but now he's falling down to a point where I may start taking him again. Jonnu, 12%. Chig, 12%. Cade Otton, 9%. Gesicki, 9%. Jatavian Sanders, 9%. So I'm pretty high in the late round tight ends, but then you see some sprinkle in here of Musgrave, Freiermuth, and then definitely McBride. And then if you go down, I have decent exposure to some of the others. We have 9% Brock Bowers, 7% Kyle Pitts, 7% Laporta, 5% Kittle, and so on. So it's really been the 2 polar opposites at tight end builds. It's either I'm going with 3 and I'm taking them all late, or I'm going with 2 and I'm taking them a little earlier. Maybe that's a flaw. Maybe if you're going with somebody like Laporta, you don't need to take a second until a very late tight end. But thus far, that is not how I've done it. So looking back at the roster builds, like I said, I've cooled off on the 3-5-7-3s. These were all very early. Like 4 of those 5 were probably in the first 10 drafts. I kind of quickly realized that I do not want to be taking 3 of each because it just limits you in terms of what you're doing with these. Unless you were truly going QB tight end at the very, very end of the draft. Your last 6 picks were QB tight end. That would really be the only place that I could justify it. And the problem with that is you almost have to really gamble that you're going to be able to correlate. I feel if you do that, you're very much limiting yourself on what tight ends and what quarterbacks you can take. It's got to be Fant, Geno. It's got to be Mayfield, Otton. It's got to be May, Hunter Henry. It's got to be Jonnu Smith, Tua, Herbert with one of his tight ends. It's got to be certain ones, Levis with the Okonkwo. Like you're probably out of the mix of some of the other tight ends that would have gone earlier, or some of the quarterbacks that would have gone earlier, because you're not going to be able to match them up. But more importantly, it's probably going to be tough to fill that and also correlate your other receivers and running backs that you took earlier. Typically, if you're going quarterback and tight end both late, you're trying to correlate those with some of the weapons at running back and receiver that you already have. So you just have to really thread an extreme needle to be able to build a team like that. So I've typically leaned with this. I'm either getting my tight ends out of the way or I'm getting my quarterbacks out of the way. And I might not go too early quarterbacks like I would tight ends, but it probably looks more like I go with a Mahomes and then I go with somebody like Kirk Cousins, Deshaun Watson, Geno Smith. Like I'm not waiting till the real back end of quarterbacks to draft them there. So a couple other things to highlight. Let's go over back to the underdog exposures. So nothing super extreme here, but I want to highlight the receivers. So I had a ton of drafts where I am going receiver heavy early. You will see a mishmash of high roster ship percentages with these receivers inside the top 30-ish. So Drake London, Devontae Smith, Pickens, Flowers, Dell. Let's see, go down a little further and see where else we have some. Waddle at 12%, Cooper at 12%, Metcalf 12%, A.J. Brown, Jamar Chase. Like, basically, I've really evened out my exposure of the top, let's just call it 35 to 40 receivers. Obviously, I have a lot of Jackson Smith at Jig, but I backed off drafting him. But now his price has actually fallen 4 or 5 spots since I was taking him. So I've started taking him again. Rashee Rice is another one that I kind of backed off taking for a while, but then I took him a ton before his price swelled up. A month ago, JSN and Rashee Rice were switched. Now they're separated by half a round based on people buying back into Rashee Rice. So if you go back over to here, elite receiver. So 40% of my teams, I already talked about the tight ends, elite receiver. So 40% of my teams have been elite receiver builds. So if you look at that, I mean, I'm very, very much hitting receiver, or doing a bunch of teams where I'm hitting, hell, I've done a team where I hit 7 straight receivers. That's probably too much. But again, I've gone away from hitting that many receivers early because I've had a ton of exposure to those receivers inside that top 36 range. And I'm paying a pretty penny for them. So one of my plans that I've noticed with this is I don't have a lot of exposure, and it'll be easier when I show this draft board here. No, player combos. There we go. Okay, so when you scroll all the way down to, actually, you know what? It'll be easier if I do the draft board. So the draft board feature here literally just shows you the current ADP, and it'll show you exposure of everywhere on this board. And this is the range where I have the most blind spots. And it's probably because the ADP was a massive gap early on, and it's starting to tighten a little bit. It's right here. It's the range when the quote-unquote threshold receivers go off the board. It ends right here at Jamison Williams. That is the last one. And then the next receiver up starts into Cortland Sutton, Curtis Samuel, Tyler Lockett. I do have a lot of Rashid Shaheed, but you see some blind spots in here. Not a lot of Cortland Sutton, only 5%. Not a lot of Tyler Lockett, only 5%. Now, those are players. If I'm drafting early Bears or early Bengals, I should probably have a little bit more of those guys. I have 12% Shaheed, but 0 Romeo Doubs. That should change because Jordan Love is on the higher end in terms of my rostership at QB. That's just a blind spot for me. 0 Mike Williams. 0 or 2% Jacoby Myers. So you see some of these receivers in this range. I have 9% AD Mitchell, but there's been receivers in this range where I have just flat out avoided. And then there's some other ones in here that typically I don't take, and I probably should increase my exposure in here as well. You can see some biases. Only 5% Ricky Pearsall, but I have 12% Jermaine Burton. 0 Quentin Johnston. So there's just some blind spots in this receiver range where if you really map it out from a best ball perspective, I understand that the names, and I'll just find a random name up here. The names, Jordan Addison, Ladd McConkey, Brian Thomas. Like there's an element of upside that runs with those guys versus you get down into here and you go, man, I don't really like Jahan Dotson or Adam Thielen. 0% Adam Thielen. That's one where it's like, I skip over it every single time. But there's an element of, from a best ball perspective, how often is the wide receiver 45 going to hit your lineup? Especially, and this is something I haven't really thought about. If I'm drafting JSN at wide receiver 45, but he's my 6th receiver, how often is he actually hitting my lineup? I'm drafting him probably with some bias saying, I think he's probably better than his ADP. But how frequently, if you really look at the fact that, you can only start so many receivers every week in your lineup, like the max you can play is 4. how often is that wide receiver 6 hitting my lineup, not compared to the other receivers, but compared to one of the receivers that goes much later. So we'll scroll down. Dontavian Wicks, wide receiver 60. Truthfully, how much more frequently is Dontavian Wicks hitting your lineup versus how frequently Christian Watson's hitting your lineup? Right? Like if you ask that question, there's obviously bias with Christian Watson. Oh, he has higher spike week potential from a week-to-week standpoint. But if you actually look at their price, here's Dontavian Wicks. So you see Dontavian Wicks all the way down here, get down to round 11. And then you go up, Christian Watson, here he is, round 7. Now, I get it, why people would prefer Christian Watson, but how much more likely is one to hit your lineup versus the other across the course of a season? And unless you're correlating, it doesn't really matter what they do when you get to the playoffs. That's going to be pure correlation. You're already betting on the team. You're betting on the structure. So if we just call it the regular season, how likely is it that your wide receiver 6, Christian Watson, is hitting your lineup? Maybe it's 3 times? And how many times is Wicks hitting your lineup? Twice? Just guesstimating or ballparking. But it just makes sense to pass on some of these receivers. So if you go back to my exposures tab here, probably going to focus more on the elite receiver build, but also mix that in with the either dual running back build or, more importantly, the robust running back build. Because there's some receivers that I have blind spots on, and the reason for those blind spots is when I'm ripping off 5, 6 receivers to start the draft, what am I then doing with my running back exposure? And we'll go to that. Notice something with the running back exposure. 21% Spears, RB34. 19% Warren, RB25. 17% Pollard, RB29. 16% Trey Benson, RB30. 16% Brian Robinson, RB31. 16% Blake Corum, RB35. 14% Ty Chandler. 14% Javonte Williams. 14% Najee Harris. Jalen Wright, 14%. Zach Charbonnet, 12%. Chuba Hubbard, 12%. Chase Brown, 12%. DeAndre Swift, 12%. Kamara's an exception. There's another one. Devin Singletary, RB33, 12%. So as you notice, I am very highly exposed to these running backs that go in this range. Right in here. So we're talking in this Jalen Warren, DeAndre Swift, Zamir White range, and down. These rounds right here. And it usually goes from right around, so we're all the way down here into the 8th. Between the 8th and the 12th round, where you start seeing Kendre Miller, Jalen Wright, Ty Chandler, Marshawn Lloyd. That's been the end of the tier break. Zach Charbonnet. So let's call it round 8 through 13. Largely, I am taking 3 running backs at least in that range. And a lot of that is just because we are early on in the offseason, and I just have a blind spot probably that some of these running backs have roles. A lot of these guys down here, not really sure. So you don't take these guys because you want to be done at running back. At least I've wanted to be done at running back for the players that I know have roles. So if you get back up here to the exposures, a lot of my teams have 5 running backs. Only 4 total teams have only 4 RBs. But if you cross-reference that with the robust RB and the dual RB strategy, that is 70% of my teams. I'm probably taking running backs early, and I'm trying to get them done by that round 13 point. And I think a lot of people draft this way, but it creates this blind spot where if I rip off 6 receivers, then I'm like, I have to just take every running back I think's going to have a role, but I also am going to probably have to have at least 5 on this team because I have so much invested in receiver already. So right there, I'm almost committing myself between that round 7 and round 13 mark. I have to take 5 receivers, which is why I have a lot of uncorrelated running backs in this range. Now, the good news is guys like Spears, easy to correlate. Warren, easy to correlate. Pollard, easy to correlate. Some of these guys are easier to correlate than others. But I just have a ton of standalone running backs in that range, which has created the gap that I was telling you about on the draft board, or I am absent a lot of the receivers that go in this range. So I need to flip that. That is something I'm going to have to cognizantly do when I'm drafting, is to make sure that I focus on those ranges, but it only happens that way when you've already set your team up. If you have 6 receivers by round 8, it's going to feel really gross to say, man, I really need to draft, that Jacoby Myers or that Brandon Cooks or that receiver in that range that I don't have a lot of exposure to, because you're not going to want to. You're going to prefer the running back value. So interesting, if you go back to this, I wanted to highlight one more thing on the exposures tab. So the stacks. This is something that I probably have to look at a little deeper. I did this on the first video. I was very highly exposed to the KC-Pittsburgh game. Remember one of the things I mentioned, LA Chargers, New England Patriots. I had very little exposure to that. I have fixed that. But there's a couple others down here. The Jets Buffalo was another one I didn't have a lot of exposure to. I've fixed that. So I've been able to build some teams incorporating those games. But this is a cool feature where it will allow you to check your quarterback stacks with multiple players. So I'll look at these here in a second. But if you look at my stacks, so here's my quarterback stacks that I have stacked with somebody. So obviously I'm high on Fields. I've taken a lot of Fields. 16% of my Fields have been stacked with one of his weapons. 14% of my Fields naked. And this is cool when you look at your naked stashes or your naked stacks that you have. The only quarterback I'm really taking naked is Fields. Is that a problem? I don't know, but I'm not taking a lot of even the rushing quarterbacks naked. That's something that I know some sharp people out there will incorporate to get their exposure up on somebody like Anthony Richardson or Jaden Daniels, a guy that's hard to stack, especially Richardson. He's very hard to stack. Other than Michael Pittman, unless you're in the receiver range of Josh Downs and A.D. Mitchell, which again, that's been the blind spot for me. But I have a blind spot of not taking any Richardson either. And I can take Richardson before I have to commit to any of those. So I think that's something I need to be doing. I don't really ever draft quarterbacks naked. Is that a problem? I don't know. Other than Fields, these are the only ones. And a lot of these were probably after their ADP. I know there was a Matt Stafford like 2 rounds after his ADP that I got. But other than that, I'm really not drafting QBs naked. And these probably aren't the types you want to either. Derek Carr, Matt Stafford, Aaron Rodgers, they don't run at all. Like those are probably awful QBs to draft naked. So it had to have been an ADP thing. But I probably should mix in some more Jaden Daniels. I should probably mix in some more Anthony Richardson. I should probably mix in some more Lamar Jackson. Even if it is just a stack at the very end, I can get Nelson Aguilar in the last round. I should probably focus on a couple of those only because I don't have a lot of exposure. And those are the ones you would want to take naked. So all quarterback stacks, as you can see, the exposure with stacks here. Will Levis, I'm pretty much always stacking Will Levis because it's very easy, whether that's with Chig, whether that's with Hopkins, or whether that's with Ridley. It's very easy to do. So I almost have 0 Will Levis where he's not stacked. But then you look at, okay, at least one player, this percentage drops. Then you go to 2 players. So Kyler Murray is the one that I'm stacking the most with multiple weapons, which means I have quite a bit of either Kyler Murray, Trey McBride with another option. It's probably not Marvin Harrison because I don't have a lot of Marvin Harrison, but it's probably a lot of Kyler with Trey McBride, who was one of my highest rostered tight ends, and then with one of the 3 receivers you can stack Kyler with between Michael Wilson, Zay Jones, and Greg Dortch. You can easily get any of those 3. So just looking through these and what are the ones that are most easily able to stack at the end, Burrow with either Higgins or Chase. You can still get Yoshivas, Jermaine Burton, or Mike Gesicki, so that's an easy one. Deshaun Watson. Even if you don't get Cooper, you can get Judy, you can get Elijah Moore, you can get Cedric Tillman, you can get David Njoku. So there's numerous options there. Geno Smith, same thing. Fant, 3 receivers you can stack them with. Mahomes, even if you don't get Kelsey, there's 3 receivers you can stack them with. So it's just interesting to look at the ones that you're most heavily stacked on for those reasons, and which ones are difficult to stack that you're also low rostered. So I identified Lamar. He's hard to stack because honestly, unless you're going at the very end with Tez Walker or Aguilar, it's Zay Flowers, it's Mark Andrews. If you don't get those guys, you're not stacking them unless you want to take Bateman. And Bateman is one where, the only team that probably should want him is the Lamar team, but he seems to be a popular one that'll just go randomly to a team that's looking for a 7th or 8th receiver. Same with Richardson. You have to be committed to taking either Downs or Mitchell or Jelani Woods, who's moved up, I think, to tight end 27 now. Like Jelani Woods has moved up significantly, and it might be for that reason that people are drafting him with Richardson, because once you are done with Downs and Mitchell, you're not getting anybody to stack with Richardson. So that is definitely a point for me to focus on, is looking at these 3-player stacks where I have a quarterback with 2 other players, and how do I increase some of the exposure on these. It's easier said than done. There's some in here that are difficult to do, like Tua Tagovailoa. Unless you're going to go Malik Washington, I'm not really interested in stacking him, so I'm probably not taking him unless I have Waddle or Tyreek. So those are either going to happen early or they're not going to happen at all. So I think that's interesting to look at. Not going to look at Week 15, but Week 16 stacks are interesting to look at. So Week 16, I did that tournament. I can't remember which one. I think it was the Mini Chihuahua 2, where the payouts were basically 0 if you got to Week 16. So I focused everything on my 20 entries there, or 20. I think it was 25 max. I did 23. I couldn't quite get it maxed out, but every one of those was focused on Week 16 correlation. So I haven't done that in BBM5, but it kind of taught me a different way to draft. And if you look at this, okay, which games am I stacking the most in Week 16? So Week 16, these are probably teams where I'm drafting Will Levis on teams where I have Michael Pittman, Will Levis on teams where I have Hopkins and or Calvin Ridley, and teams where I actually can find weapons later to bring back. So there's numerous options on the Colts that I could stack with Will Levis late. So it's just finding the exposure to this game, and then also looking at, all right, if you're going to stack in Week 16, where can you crossover stack in Week 17 and do the same thing? So this is an interesting one. Pittsburgh and Baltimore, Houston and Kansas City, right? So Pittsburgh plays Kansas City in Week 17. Houston plays Baltimore in Week 17. But they play each other in Week 16. Pittsburgh's got Baltimore and Houston has Kansas City. So that is one where, and the problem is the players are expensive for the most part with those 3 teams, especially with Baltimore, Houston, Kansas City, and even Pittsburgh to an extent. But building some teams that are almost just, like I may go in and do a draft, and it probably won't be one that I stream just because it'll probably be a fast draft that I'm just sitting there doing on my phone because I have a specific focus. And it's just take all Texans, Chiefs, Steelers, and Ravens for the most part. I leave the draft with 12 players from those 4 teams, knowing I have this right here, right? Like literally knowing I have these crossovers right here. And really, that's the one that makes the most sense to do it. You can also do it. San Fran plays Miami. Cleveland plays Cincinnati. And then Miami plays Cleveland in Week 17. And then if you look at San Fran plays Detroit. And then Detroit plays Chicago. And it was the other one that cross-references with that, Seattle and Minnesota. So there's a couple in there where you can look at and go, okay, if I get exposure to 3 teams, I can heavily correlate Week 16 and Week 17. So I think looking at those and trying to differentiate within those games will be pretty crucial going forward. So interesting to look at that with Baltimore, Pittsburgh, and with Houston, Kansas City. Going to Week 17 with QBs, KC and Pittsburgh clearly the highest. Then you look at Arizona and the Rams. Jets, Buffalo was one that was up. Miami, Cleveland. Some of the Week 16 matchups, like if you're really heavily exposed on Philly, Dallas, and you want to differentiate your Philly, Dallas teams, focus on some Washington players, and then Dallas plays Tampa Bay. Those are 2 easier ones to get. If you miss out on getting Hurts or Dak, focus on getting some Jaden Daniels, or do some Dallas, Tampa Bay teams, and you use some of those players to differentiate the stacks that are going to be extremely highly correlated and highly stacked. I mean, Rams, Cardinals, Philly, Dallas, Seattle, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco, and then for me, Houston, Baltimore, obviously very low. Those are probably the 5 most popular games to stack. Green Bay, Minnesota is up there as well because it's the last game of the year and it's in a dome. But I think looking at these and figuring out, okay, I probably don't need to build a lot more Kansas City, Pittsburgh teams. Probably don't need to go in on a ton more Arizona, LA Rams teams. But if I'm going to go more in on Green Bay, Minnesota, Houston, Baltimore, couple of these others, maybe Detroit, San Francisco, I can use a couple more. Chicago, Seattle, I can use a couple more. If you're going to do that, find ways to differentiate by trying to stack some of these games together. Again, focus on 2 game stacks in week 17 and try to have those crossover in week 16. Even if you're focusing on even 3 in week 17, see if you can find the ones where they also cross over in week 16. And that is where something like Spike Week really helps you, because when you're in the live draft room, and I'll just pull up a live draft room for everybody. I think I only have one going on right now. Yeah, pull up this poodle so everybody can see. So when you go to the draft, you can look here, and I've showed this on the streams a couple times, but when you go to the draft, then you go to the poodle, and I have to scroll out so everybody can see. Okay. So you'll be able to go number of game stacks by week right here. So for this poodle, I already have 3 week 17 game stacks. But then you go down here, I only have 1 week 16 game stack. And this is where something like the Spike Week tool can be very helpful, because sure, I'm focusing on week 17. I don't even know what this team literally looks like. That's what happens when you're doing a ton of teams. So I have it's a Mahomes team. It's got George Pickens as a bring back. It's got Rashee Rice as a stack. It's got Pat Freiermuth as a bring back. So I have 4 players from the Chiefs and Steelers game. So if you go to games by team view, here we go. So yeah, I have Mahomes and Rice. Then I have Pickens and Freiermuth. Then you look at right here, I have Jacoby Myers, and then I have Alvin Kamara and Rashid Shaheed. So that's my second game stack. And then I have Philly and Dallas. You have Saquon, Devontae Smith, and Dallas Goedert. And then I have CeeDee Lamb. Now, what I was able to do here is get Baker Mayfield, right? So Baker Mayfield all the way up. Boom. Baker Mayfield correlates with Dallas in week 16. Now, the problem is I'm probably going to get shut out unless I get Jalen McMillan. This is probably a team where I should take Trey Palmer and I should take Jalen McMillan because I need 2 more receivers. But that is a perfect example of, okay, I've already built out the Dallas-Philly stack, right? Like I went early on Saquon and CeeDee Lamb. Those are my first 2 picks. I got Devontae Smith, so I'm heavily invested in that game already. Then I end up with Dallas Goedert. But I don't take Hurts. I didn't get Hurts, right? Obviously, I passed on Hurts, and I went with Devontae Smith, and I'm not getting Hurts in round 4 or round 5, so that's out. And then I chose to take Dallas Goedert. So I like my tight end correlation here because it correlates with Lamb, Smith, Barkley. I have enough exposure to Dallas, Philly. I don't need either of the quarterbacks. But when I've already built out that team, and that's going to be probably a pretty popular team, Lamb, Smitty, Saquon. I don't know how many will have that, but there will be other teams that have that combination. Tack on Goddard. Again, enough to the game where I don't need a quarterback, but let's say there's 15 teams that have at least 3 of those 4 players when you get to the last week or you get to the second to last week. Let's just call it, 20 teams that have at least 3 of those players between Goddard, Barkley, Smith, and CeeDee Lamb. How do I differentiate those teams? And that's where you go back to this and you go, okay, week 16, I'm already in on Dallas, Philly. Philly plays Washington. Dallas plays Tampa Bay. So the way to do it is go, okay, I've already committed to this as my primary stack. Philly, Dallas is my primary stack. I'm trying to find them on this sheet. Here we go. Philly, Dallas is my primary stack. So I should focus on building a bring back with one of those games heavily. So that's why I took Baker Mayfield. Honestly, this is a league where I'm on the turn, so I really can't even remember my thoughts because it was like 5 days ago when I drafted Mayfield. But it's probably to draft Mayfield. And as you see, I put in my queue. What have I put in my queue? Luke McCaffrey, Washington. But more importantly, Jalen McMillan, Luke McCaffrey. So the purpose was to correlate one of the other games that I'm already heavily built into. I could do the same here, except for with Kansas City and Pittsburgh. Obviously, I'm only would be chasing Baltimore and Houston, which, again, are pretty tough to chase given their Week 16 matchups with Pittsburgh, with Baltimore, and with Kansas City and Houston. But the fact that Baltimore and Houston is already spoken for. So you can't really do it there unless you do it a bit earlier. So I know I'm kind of rambling, but I just wanted to highlight that. Those are things that I probably need to be focusing a little bit more on, and that's why I'm going to rip off a bunch of slow drafts, is really thinking through, okay, I know I'm going to be going heavy with these types of teams. I already highlighted these week 17 stacks that I want to get more into. And then how do I bring those back with some week 16 correlation, even if that's just random late receivers or a random late running back, or you could even get your exposure through the custodian QB if you want. You know, like a Michael Penix. The Michael Penix team that I took had guys like Terry McLaurin, Kyle Pitts on it. So instead of taking another Washington or Atlanta player, I'm trying to say, okay, there's a world where it's Michael Penix starting in that game. That gives me that exposure, but it would also correlate beautifully if I had a team that had some Eagles and Cowboys exposure. Because now I'm going, okay, I have Atlanta with Washington. Penix is there. He's going to correlate with Washington players that I've already drafted, and then I'm going to correlate that with some of the Philly and Dallas exposure that I already have. So if you think about a Michael Penix, Jalen Hurts team, and the players you would target in those games, right? Like Penix doesn't play Jalen Hurts, so I'm not ending up with a quarterback matchup where they could be facing each other, but Washington plays both quarterbacks in week 16 and week 17. So I'm already knowing I'm going to be focusing on probably getting at least 3 pieces of Washington. And then I'm going to build out maybe a Drake London, maybe a Kyle Pitts, maybe a Darnell Mooney, maybe a Rondale Moore. And I'm also going to obviously be focusing on building out a couple of Dallas players. So that's going to be one of the last things that I really have to dial in, is turning on the Spike Week tool and making sure that you have some sort of notice or highlights. I typically highlight week 16 and week 17. I've largely ignored week 15 correlation. I'd like to get feedback from people on if they think that's something that is maybe a little more important than what I'm placing on it. But I'm really trying to focus on getting some week 16 correlation. But I don't want to, in this tournament, with the payout structure of BBM5, I don't want to solely build on week 16 correlation. I want to get my week 16 correlation by already having my week 17 correlation planned out and built. And some are easier than others. It's impossible to get all of them when you're only doing 150 teams. But I just wanted to share that strategy of a big focus for me going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and unshare the screen. So I was kind of rambling on that episode, just kind of going through my thoughts. There's literally 3 hours of stuff that I could talk about, maybe even more. Just with Underdog. I've learned a lot. I've thought about the game a lot differently with this. One thing that I didn't really mention on the stream, because it's hard to highlight with the ADP, is really thinking about, as we get closer to the season, the projected ownership of a lot of the players. Spike Week has their own projected ownership that slowly starts to get built up. It's not perfect. You're never going to have the exact ownership, probably, of what's going on in the tournament, but really thinking about, especially as things become more efficient, because that is one thing that will happen as we get into training camp in the preseason. The later round players that are getting taken will be more efficient. There's more information. They'll be more efficient. So really thinking about, okay, this player I was drafting early on, let's say you were drafting a lot of A.T. Perry early on. I was drafting a decent amount of A.T. Perry. I think I have like 12% A.T. Perry. But then Juwan Johnson gets hurt. He starts to move up. Now, he doesn't move up so far that you're really having to take him anywhere but round 17 or round 18 anyway. So I would continue to take him. But let's say we get into the preseason and maybe one of Shaheed or Olave gets hurt. A.T. Perry now starts to go in round 14, round 15. Still a good value. If you correlate him right, I have no problem taking him in round 14 or 15 versus round 17 or 18 before. But one thing you have to think about is, what is his going to be overall rostership of the tournament? Meaning he was already getting drafted a decent amount in May or June. Like not every draft, but he wasn't at 0.5%. Let's call it 20% of the time he was getting drafted. 10 to 20% of the time he was getting drafted. That's going to bump up to 100% of all drafts that happen after August 1st, which means his overall exposure in the tournament is going to be pretty high. And right now, as of the time that I am recording this, BBM5, if you look at the overall fill rate right now of BBM5, we're looking at, check and see, we're at 32% full. So you think about he's only getting drafted 20% of the time, let's say, when it's only 32% full. So if you map that out, there's going to be a chunk of teams he's not going to be on. But as that draft percentage rises up to where he's getting drafted now in 99% of drafts, yet 50% of the drafts in BBM5 encompasses that 99% of the time he's getting drafted, he's going to be highly owned. He's going to be owned in 60% of the leagues across BBM5. That's you're not getting a huge edge against the field, especially if he moves up to rounds 14, 15, 16. You have to really think about, am I getting the edge against the field by drafting a player that's going to be 60% rostered when he's still in this wide receiver 90, wide receiver 80 to 100 range? That's probably not where I want to be taking a lot of exposure of that player. I want to get correlated exposure. But really what I want to focus on is, especially as we get closer to the season, where are the blind spots that you can identify before other people to where you maybe want significant exposure to certain situations or certain receivers, knowing they're not going to be highly rostered. The ones that come to mind, somebody like Noah Brown. It's a perfect example. Andre Yoshivas, perfect example. Nelson Aguilar, another good example. Kadarius Toney, another good example. Chase Claypool was a good example until everybody starts drafting Chase Claypool. So he's also going to be very, very highly rostered in terms of just teams taking him already. You know, people are already drafting Chase Claypool. Now that might fade away, but looking for some of these opportunities where I really believe in the offense. Greg Dortch is another one that people are starting to draft Greg Dortch, but if he continues to stay where he is and his draft rate doesn't really go up past 5-10%, that's another one. Getting exposure to the game stacks and the correlation that everybody already wants, but you have the different piece. Because the odds that a receiver that goes wide receiver 100 hits your lineup more than once or twice is very low. But then you look at what's the expected times that wide receiver 75 hits your lineup? Twice? Maybe? So the difference is minimal. That's why the ADP difference doesn't really matter. So I think differentiating yourself against the field, I really don't want to have, trying to give an example of a receiver that goes in that range. Here, I can look at my board. I know I'm not sharing the screen, but so here's a guy that gets drafted constantly. Every draft he's getting drafted, right? Jalen Tolbert. He's going to probably be not 100% drafted, but it'll probably be in the 90s, right? So 98% of the time, Jalen Tolbert is getting drafted. Assuming nothing happens with him between now and the season, he's going to be rostered 99% of the leagues in BBM5. But then you look at, okay, can I get other exposure to the Dallas offense at a fraction of that rostership percentage? Ryan Flournoy, wide receiver 118. Now, the odds that Flournoy is better than Tolbert is probably not a great bet. Let's call it 80-20. But it's still 20. But then you look at Ryan Flournoy is only going to get drafted in less than 1% of teams. So it really makes sense in these expected ranges where a player is only going to hit your lineup twice at the very most. That's where you want to differentiate. That's where you really want to go, okay, who is the receiver in Detroit that people are not drafting? People are drafting Khalif Raymond. They're not drafting Donovan Peoples-Jones. People are drafting Chase Claypool. They're not drafting Marquez Valdez-Scantling. People are drafting Tez Walker. They're not drafting Nelson Aguilar. People are drafting Jacob Cowling, or people are drafting Jawan Jennings. They're not drafting Jacob Cowling. So you scroll down a little bit and you go, okay, wait a second. People are drafting Tyler Boyd. They're not drafting Treylon Burks. People are drafting Demarcus Robinson. They're not drafting Tutu Atwell. So we're very fixated on who it is, yet the rostership percentage versus the expected production. Basically what I'm saying, and I'll end the video here, you have to get lucky for either Ryan Flournoy or Jalen Tolbert to probably hit your lineup. You got to get damn lucky for them to hit your lineup in week 16 or week 17 when you're correlating out their team stacks. But the final thing is, if you find yourself miraculously in week 17 and you're going, man, these Dallas and Philly players have carried me there. I have Dak, I have Saquon, I have Smitty, I have Jake Ferguson, and I'm sitting pretty, man. This game's going to be a shootout. But then you look and you go, wow, okay, of the teams at the final table, again, a lot of them have at least 3 of those 4 players. A lot of the Dak teams, which Dak would be the quarterback that I would want to primarily drive that stack, right? There's going to be a lot of teams that also have players that have Jalen Hurts, teams that have Jalen Hurts with similar players. So clearly I need Dak to outperform Hurts. Otherwise, I'm going to lose to the teams that have Hurts. If Hurts goes for 35 points and Dak goes for 20, my stack may smash. But those teams that correlated with Hurts are going to have a leg up. But then you're going to look and you go, wait a second, I'm in on Dak. But of all the other teams that are in on Dak, 80% of them have Jalen Tolbert. Shit, I have Jalen Tolbert. Wait, I have Ryan Flournoy, not Jalen Tolbert. Okay. I still need Ryan Flournoy to outperform Jalen Tolbert. But the odds are neither of them are going to crack the lineup. But if they do, I have the one that differentiates. So it kind of makes me, just thinking about this exercise, I know I said I would end it, but I'm just fascinated by this topic. It really makes me want to avoid all the popular receivers in this wide receiver 80 and beyond. Like, I don't need another Demarcus Robinson. I don't need another Jalen McMillan. I don't need Zay Jones. I don't need Jalen Tolbert or Tez Walker or Tyler Boyd. You just go down the line. DJ Chark. The reason those guys are where they are is because those are who people prefer because they're stackable with guys they've already drafted. That's all it is. It has very little to do with, I know this is a better player than that. Like, you literally look at that tier and you go, what do all of them have in common? Robinson, okay, stack with Stafford. McCaffrey, okay, stacked with Jaden Daniels. McMillan, okay, I can stack with Baker Mayfield. Tolbert, Tez Walker, Zay Jones, all very easily to stack with quote-unquote elite quarterbacks. But then you just scroll down and you go, wait a second, I can get exposure to the same offenses and I can go down a little further. I can get Noah Brown at 104. I can get Brendan Rice. Why DJ Chark over Brendan Rice? Right? I mean, I prefer DJ Chark if I had to pick, but the biggest thing is I don't have to pick them anywhere except for the same round, the last round of my draft. But why should the tiebreaker be Brendan Rice? Because DJ Chark's going to get drafted in 70% of drafts. Brendan Rice, probably less than 5%. That's the edge. That's where the DFS principles come into play. And there's a lot smarter people than me that can talk about that. But if you really think about it, we're trying to win a tournament with 672,000 teams. You're shooting for the once-in-a-lifetime outcome. So why pigeonhole yourself relying on Dak and Jalen Tolbert? You think it's Dak and Jalen Tolbert, and man, that's going to separate myself. But then I bet if you had the access to the rostership data across Underdog, you'd go, how many Dak and Jalen Tolbert stacks are there? So of the 672,000 teams, right, you're looking at, what is that going to end up being? Like 50, I don't know the math in my head, but it's more than 50,000 Underdog drafts in BBM5, right? Because you have to multiply it by 12 because there's 12 teams in each draft. There's more than 50,000 drafts. So let's just say, and I literally have not done the math. So let's just call it 55,000 drafts in BBM5. I know the number is probably somewhere close to that. Jalen Tolbert's going to get drafted in 50,000 of them. And do you know how many of those are going to have Dak Prescott? A lot. So really, what are you separating yourself out? If I could show you on the very last day that BBM5 is open, how many times Dak and Jalen Tolbert are stacked? And it's like, wow, they're stacked 24,000 times across this tournament. How many times are Dak and Ryan Flournoy stacked? 14. Think about that leverage. Think about that. Forget about this changing who you draft at QB and who you correlate with early. But if you really think about it, there is a hive mind that is going on right now in this Underdog ADP. And that is my number one goal with the remaining drafts that I have in BBM5 is to get out of the hive mind that currently exists, especially at the wide receiver position. late. So I've gone almost 55 minutes, almost the same length as a draft. A lot more I could talk about. Again, I'm here. This is my first year doing this. I still have a ton to learn. I've already made some mistakes that I'm going to probably try to rectify next year. It's been a blast. I'm looking forward to the summer of drafting and really building out this portfolio. Leave comments, questions in the chat. Maybe I'll do a follow-up episode, maybe on a podcast at some point, just so everybody kind of has some follow-up with questions that they leave on here. I appreciate everybody that's been rocking with DD, rocking with me and Ray and the Best Ball Night School guys and Ike and Gene on Off the Line. We're all doing Underdog stuff. It's been a blast. It's been super fun, and I'm looking forward to it the rest of the summer. If you're not signed up, I can't imagine that you are sitting here this far into the video and you're not signed up. But if you haven't signed up, use promo code ALLGAS. You get up to a $250 bonus cash with your deposit that you make, and you might find me in a draft room sometime this summer if you're jumping into any of the tournaments that are out there. So I'll sign off for the week. Happy 4th of July to everybody. Looking forward to crushing it with the content the rest of the summer. It's going to be live Draft Central from here on out until the middle of August, where I'll probably do another recap show talking about the portfolio. So with that, I will sign off for the week. Be chill, everyone.